You are listening to audio from The Table. If you'd like to learn more about our community or donate to this ministry, please visit thetabletx.org.
Hello, Table Podcast listeners. Brett here, grace and peace. It is so good to be with you all yet again. So we are in part 4 in our series titled Unclean, Drawing Near in a Runaway World. So this series, based on Richard Beck's book of the same title, Unclean, has been about many things. On its surface, it's kind of been about disgust, what we would call disgust psychology, the way that we can come to view not merely things as gross or toxic or contaminated or something, things like sweat or moldy food or cockroaches, but ultimately how through our moral imaginations we can very easily come to view people as not just physically, but really morally, kind of inwardly gross, contaminated, revolting, disgusting. Now, I say on its surface it's been about disgust because upon further reflection, really it's been a series about love and our struggles, what we might call our failures to love. Whether it's happening through disgust psychology run amok, or as we talked about last week, just the kind of process we have of subtly dehumanizing others. We have many failures to love. But the hope of this series is that by bringing some awareness, vigilance, spiritual disciplines to these struggles, perhaps over time, we could learn to love, if not perfectly, at least better, just decently, maybe more consistently like Christ. So our scripture throughout the series has been a story from Matthew chapter 9, verses 9 through 13. Which says this: As Jesus went on from there, he saw a man named Matthew sitting at the tax collector's booth. "Follow me," he told him, and Matthew got up and followed him. While Jesus was having dinner at Matthew's house, many tax collectors and sinners came and ate with him and his disciples. When the Pharisees saw this, they asked his disciples, "Why does your teacher eat with tax collectors and sinners?" On hearing this, Jesus said, "It is not the healthy who need a doctor, but the sick. But go and learn what this means. I desire mercy, not sacrifice, for I have not come to call the righteous, but sinners." Okay, so lurking in the shadows of this series, this series with its call to radical love that crosses the chasms that holiness constructs, this series with its call to overcome our disgust psychology and move towards people, towards communities and groups that we may have been distant from. This series with its call to a very radical hospitality, a welcome, just an open, unquestioning embrace of the other. Well, lurking in the shadows have been many questions. Questions like, is purity bad? Are all those metaphors bad? Even holiness? Like, is holiness kind of a problem? But I wonder if in ways kind of all the questions might be summed up in one question. And that question is also the title of the message this week. And it's simply this: are boundaries bad? I think that's the question that goes right to the heart of things. Are boundaries themselves bad? Like, for example, we've done a lot of talk in this series about morality. So just think of it in terms of boundaries. Moral boundaries. What is a moral boundary? Well, it's simply saying this is right, and that thing over there, well, that's wrong, right? There's good behavior, there's bad behavior, with very clear lines. But as we've been discussing about the series, drawing those kinds of moral boundaries ultimately leads to the worst kind of religious, communal, even kind of social, political judgmentalism. It becomes disgust psychology running amok. Everything we've been talking about has been really pointing out the problems with our moral boundaries. Or think of a different kind of category. Think of communal boundaries. Right? Saying we are this kind of people with these ways of living or these shared commitments, whether that's at the level of the family or something else. I mean, but doesn't that not lead to the worst forms of tribalism? In other words, the minute you have a group of any sort, you have people not in the group. Whether that group is as I mentioned, like America or my church friends or just the people in my office who I know versus those I don't know or like so much. And what does that trigger, though? This was like our whole message last week. We begin sliding towards dehumanization and even ultimately disgust of the outsiders. In fact, I have a somewhat awkward moment in every single Welcome to the Table class that we do. For those unfamiliar, that's basically our new members class at the table. And in part 1 of that class, I talk about not only our kind of mission and vision, but our values. And one of those values is to be inclusive. And that's, of course, along like any category or line you could think of, racial, class, sexual orientation, gender, and so on. We really want big tent Christianity. We want everyone welcomed at the table. And yet right after that section, I go into beliefs. And I basically name, we are a Christian community. We are centered on Christ. And we have certain beliefs about Christ's divinity and crucifixion and resurrection, and even certain ideas around the Bible, and even moral beliefs. Certain things are right and wrong, and so on. And, I'm clear in the class that I'm not saying, like, if you don't agree with every single word of that, get out of this church. But still, I proceed to name all our communal boundaries. But the question would be, and this is why it's always a little awkward, like, you just finished talking about how inclusive you are, and now suddenly it's like all the boundaries. So isn't that a problem? Like, does that not inevitably lead, I mean, we've seen it all over the world, to just the worst forms of tribalism and religious exclusivism? So we've talked about moral boundaries, talked about communal boundaries. What about personal boundaries? The setting of personal boundaries, and not only in extreme situations of, like abuse and such, but even just in day-to-day life, when we have to say something like, look, I will give this much, or between these times, but not those other times. I will love in these ways, but also not those ways. Or sometimes I'm going to have to just say, no. You're like, hey, can you help me today? No. I can't watch your children tonight. I'm exhausted. I can't go to that game or support you in that way. I desperately need a nap. I'm so sorry. But here's the thing. Do not those setting of personal boundaries, do those not become the very walls, the chasms that hinder our love for others? In fact, to take a little more extreme example, think of the Pharisees, the story we just read earlier from Matthew 9. Now, from our perspective in the Matthew 9 story, well, they just kind of look and sound like jerks. They're like, I'm not going to eat with those people, But from their perspective, is it not their right as religious individuals to choose who they feel comfortable eating with? Who they feel comfortable accepting into their circles of care? They're just setting personal boundaries, right? I mean, they read Dr. Henry Cloud's book, Boundaries. And boy, they are implementing it. They're very thorough. In other words, perhaps the message of the book Unclean is more radical than we thought. Perhaps it's to simply eradicate every boundary, to practice a radical hospitality that extends the arms of embrace to everyone at all times, in all places, in every moment. To never, ever, ever turn down a request for help, because that would be a failure to love. Perhaps. But I don't think so. And even Richard Beck, I think, would disagree with that. In fact, it was only upon a second kind of reading or going back through this book to prepare for this series that I caught a quote from him where he actually says, it's a little over halfway through the book, he says, just to be clear, this is the quote, "There will be boundaries." Those 4 words, really key words though. There will be boundaries. In other words, and now I'm putting this in my own language, friends, 3 things I know. Your taxes are due April 15th. The boys in my house are unbelievably loud. And there will be boundaries. It's absolutely inevitable. One of the kind of cool things about this book, Unclean, is that it was published 11 years ago. back in 2011. And one of the upsides to that is that Richard Beck, the author, he's been able to continue to reflect on the themes from the book and even kind of respond to pushback and such in blog posts. He's a prolific blogger, writes like every day, has for like well over a decade. And I found some posts where he's reflecting on the book, and he's reflecting on some of the challenges of community and groups and tribes and such. And he writes these words. He says, "You can't have a community, even a welcoming community, without creating some boundaries and distinctions. A community without boundaries, like shared commitments or binding promises, isn't a community." He says, "Were I to rewrite Unclean today, I'd have added nuances that push back upon a simplistic message that moral and communal boundaries are intrinsically bad." You know, along these lines of personal, moral, communal boundaries, something else that may have been on your mind throughout the series is, what about those other scriptures that do indeed name boundaries, especially boundaries of morality and community? Because we've obviously been looking at Matthew 9, and there's plenty of passages where Jesus is, crossing the chasms that holiness constructs and such, and like breaking the boundaries, But in your mind, maybe have been the others, like, in fact, here's a classic example. This is, and maybe one of the more extreme ones. This is found in 1 Corinthians chapter 5. So this is the Apostle Paul writing to a church in the ancient city of Corinth. And he says this: "It is actually reported that there is sexual immorality among you, and of a kind that even pagans do not tolerate. A man is sleeping with his father's wife." Now, the language there, that's kind of interesting. It's a weird way to put it. Like, you mean his mom? We don't know. Is he avoiding that because of he's a little bit just kind of grossed out with the incestuous, kind of nature of that? So he's kind of trying to play it off a little bit, like put it a little more gently, his father's wife. Or maybe it's a situation almost like a stepmom, maybe his mom passed away or divorced or something, so now it's the stepmom. Regardless, that was the situation, right? And I think probably you'd agree, like, yeah, it's not good. You've got to have some moral boundaries, and sleeping with your mom or your stepmom, it's not good. But then he goes on in verse 2 and he says, "And you are proud." Which is another weird line. Like, they don't go into, or he doesn't, so we don't know exactly why. Maybe it's because they consider themselves, like, we are really radical in our love. And we don't judge ever anything whatsoever. No boundary. Maybe that's why they're kind of proud of their own, like, hey, we welcome everyone. Instead, he says this, he says, "So, and you are proud. Shouldn't you rather have gone into mourning and have put out of your fellowship the man who has been doing this?" I mean, basically, Paul's like, I got to draw a boundary. Like, you need to remove him from the community. Now, we could debate, like, whether that's too far or something. But I think the point stands. Paul is naming, like, look, every community will have some moral boundaries. To kind of try to bring this home to the table, let's just say, like, we had someone who had really struggled with pedophilia. In fact, they had hurt children, previously. But they not only wanted to, like, attend the service, but they came to me and they said, "Hey, I'd love to serve in kids ministry." Do we welcome all people all the time? I mean, hey, the table's value is to be inclusive. No, no, there will be boundaries. And, because we have so many kids here at the table, we might even need to talk about just different either ways for them to worship with us, maybe online, or maybe there's a different church that doesn't have children, or, we just have to be creative, but still the fact would remain, like, that, there'd have to be some boundaries. Or let's say, here's a personal boundary. Let's say I asked you to lead a ministry or serve in some way at the table. But you were in a season where you felt just stretched way too thin, and you knew it would be overcommitting yourself to say yes to that. So you turned me down. You turned down serving in the church. How could you? But what is that? It's a personal boundary. And like, that's okay. You're just a human being, not a god. Like, you don't have infinite time and energy and capacity. Or here's one last example. The book Unclean, this is obviously a very powerful argument in favor of something we practice here at our church known as an open communion table. What that means is that we welcome all people to come forward to partake of the body and blood of Christ, regardless of their moral standing or even theological commitments. Like if there's something in them that wants to connect with Christ, then they're welcome to come forward. Now, this is in contrast to what's known as a closed table. In certain churches practice a closed table. And a closed table has certain moral or theological or communal requirements tied to it before you can partake of communion. Now, based on the series, I think it would be quite easy to think to ourselves, open table good, closed table bad. But the truth is, it's actually more complicated than that. There's a different book titled Torture in Eucharist by William Cavanaugh that names why. So it's based on a study of the very challenging, the fraught relationship between the political leaders of the country of Chile in the 1970s and 80s with the church leaders of that same country. And basically the situation was that you had General Pinochet. He was a military dictator who enacted a widespread use of torture during his regime. And it was so widespread that it became not uncommon for both torturers and the tortured to be part of the same church and to come forward at the end of the service to the same table of the Lord. So what did the church do? Well, they went 1 Corinthians 5. They excommunicated the torturers. They said, look, you're not in right standing with the church. They barred them from the communion table. Was it because they were meanies? No. It was because they saw that in a situation where you have a very gross injustice occurring to a person or a group of people, to demand that an oppressor and an oppressed person come to the same table, that both places an unbearable weight upon the oppressed person, but it also kind of makes a mockery of the cross of Christ. I mean, he was the tortured one, right? It's a violation of the social moral standards of the church. So in essence, we're right back to Beck's point. Look, there will be boundaries. There will be. It's inevitable. There will be personal, there will be moral, there will be communal boundaries. Okay, so what on earth are we to do? I mean, it basically seems like we are, let's pick our metaphor, we're caught between a rock and a hard place, or the irresistible force has met the immovable object. Like on the one hand, set a boundary, whether moral, communal, personal, but then what do you risk? Well, the book Unclean's all about it, like naming it. You risk a slide towards dehumanization and disgust. But on the other hand, refuse to set a boundary, and you risk utterly losing your personal or communal integrity, like the very glue holding you together. And yet, here we are, living this out day after day. What on earth are we to do? Well, Beck, he doesn't so much offer like a simplistic solution, like 3 easy steps to resolve this. It's more like he just offers wisdom, and he's drawing from a theologian named Miroslav Volf in his book Exclusion and Embrace. And so this is, I'm not quoting, but this is kind of inspired by Beck and Volf. Here's, I think, the way forward. We've got to make the desire to embrace. We've got to make the will to affirm the dignity of every person the primary focus of your life and the primary focus of our church. The key word there is primary, not the only, not the exclusive, but the main thing. That's what it's about. Which means we've got to keep questions of boundaries, personal, moral, communal. We've got to keep those secondary. Now, can you hear how that's different than saying, throw away your boundaries? No, there will be boundaries. It's unavoidable. But, oh, church, hear me. Keep the desire to embrace. Keep the affirmation of the inherent image of God in every person before any question of their, moral goodness or whatever. Like, keep that the heart heartbeat of your life. Keep that the heartbeat of our church. It must be first. It must be prioritized first. And we've got to remain constantly vigilant and aware of how disgust psychology and the subtle impulse to dehumanize just slips in there. And before we know it, in the name of boundaries, in the name of goodness, in the name of purity and decency and safety or whatever, our desire to embrace just withers. All this, of course, has really got me thinking about my own life and story. And as I've named before, we came from a church that we loved deeply and continue to love deeply. The people there are really good, but we clashed on the question of being LGBTQ affirming. And so I've been reflecting on that in light of, really this whole series, but especially this week's message. And it kind of gave me fresh insight into it because I realized, on the one hand, I don't feel enmity or fury towards them. I think I've mostly avoided a posture of dehumanization. I have my days, but you know what I mean? On the whole, I think we've been able to mostly avoid that. And yet, at the same time, I created a boundary. And I said, I can't be in fellowship with you in the way I was before. I cannot. And honestly, they've done the same. If I hadn't resigned, they would have fired me. But here's the thing. Anyone from that church could walk through the doors of the table, and I would embrace them. And you know what's beautiful? This would be true vice versa. In fact, I have been back to that church, and I was embraced, not just in the bigger metaphorical sense, but literally hugged. Not shunned, not avoided. Embraced. Why? What's going on there? It's about a deep will to embrace that remains primary. And this is where communities go wrong, when suddenly my moral beliefs and standards wither my desire to embrace. That's where we go wrong. So church, let's keep the dignity of people. Keep a heart to welcome them. Absolutely primary in everything that we do. In the name of the Father, the Son, and the Holy Spirit. Amen.